On July 28, 1808, a major event was unfolding within the Ottoman Empire's palaces. Sultan Mehmed IV, who had been placed on the throne just 14 months earlier by a Janissary rebellion, had issued execution orders for the former Sultan Selim III, who was still living in captivity in the palace, and Mahmud, the next heir to the throne. However, Governor Alemdar Mustafa Pasha, a staunch supporter of the deposed Selim III, was on the verge of entering Istanbul with his army of 15,000 men. If the assassins were delayed, Alemdar Mustafa's forces could overthrow Mehmed IV, who was under the control of the Janissaries. 20 palace officials aligned with the Janissaries stormed the quarters of former Sultan Selim III, who had been imprisoned for 14 months. The former Sultan's wife, the head of the palace women, Rifet, threw herself in front of the intruders, but she was swiftly overpowered. The rebels cut off the fingers of Pakize, the treasurer of the harem, who tried to protect the Sultan, before plunging a dagger into Selim's temple, killing him. He became the third Ottoman Sultan to be killed in a Janissary uprising. 186 years earlier, Sultan Osman II had met the same fate, followed by Sultan Ibrahim 160 years before. As the rebels broke down the doors of the palace chambers, screams echoed throughout the corridors. After Selim's death, their next target was the heir to the throne, Prince Mahmud. The 33-year-old Ottoman prince waited in terror. The rebels smashed through the door to his quarters, but the room was empty. Mahmud had been taken to the corridor known as the Golden Path in the harem by his Circassian concubine, Chevri Khalfa, who stood guard with a sword in hand, ready to protect him. There, they could only be reached via a single staircase. Two of the prince's teachers, Anber Aga and Isa Aga, who were not soldiers, arrived just in time and positioned themselves at the top of the stairs. Meanwhile, Qasim Aga, another teacher, fought the rebels at the bottom of the stairs, hoping to buy the prince a few precious minutes. He was eventually wounded and collapsed. The rebels then rushed upward, forcing Anber and Isa Aga to retreat. Suddenly, the door to the chamber burst open. Prince Mahmud's Circassian concubine, Chevri Khalfa, emerged, tucking her skirts into her belt. She held a shovel full of burning embers from the room's brazier. In a desperate move, she flung the hot coals into the eyes of the rebels, the room filled with ash, smoke, and chaos. Seizing the moment, Isa and Anber Aga helped Prince Mahmud climb through a large chimney in the corner of the room, leading him up to the roof. Exhausted and out of strength, Chevri Khalfa was kicked in the stomach and collapsed. One of the rebels threw a dagger, wounding the prince's arm, and as he fled, his forehead was left bloodied from a blow. Just as the rebels turned toward the chimney, the sounds of Alemdar Mustafa Pasha's army entering the palace echoed through the halls. Despite the thousands of Janissary supporters throughout the empire, there were only 20 rebels in the palace, and they slipped away quietly. When Alemdar Mustafa Pasha saw the blood-soaked body of his friend, the former Sultan Selim III, he cradled him and wept. "Oh, my lord, I came to restore you to the throne. And yet my cursed eyes must witness this? How could I not take revenge on your killers?" At that moment, he noticed a well-dressed young man descending from one rooftop to another, making his way down a staircase. "Who is that?" asked one of his men. Another replied, "That is Prince Mahmud, nephew of the martyred Sultan Selim." The old Pasha stood up abruptly and declared, "No, you will call him Sultan Mahmud." And with that, the reign of Sultan Mahmud II was declared, marking the fall of Sultan Mehmed IV. That day, the severed heads of 33 rebels were mounted on the palace walls. In the days that followed, nearly 1,000 people were executed for their involvement in the murders. Sultan Mahmud II spared the life of the former Sultan, Mehmed IV. But when a coup attempt occurred 4 months later, Mehmed was executed as well. However, the true instigators of the chaos, the Janissaries, remained untouched. Not even Alemdar Mustafa Pasha's army was strong enough to deal with them, and some of their key demands were accepted. Nonetheless, Sultan Mahmud II remained on the throne. Now, let's fast forward 20 years. It's June 16, 1826. Istanbul is once again gripped by tension. The Janissaries, having heard rumors that Sultan Mahmud was preparing to form a special army outside their ranks, were on the verge of revolt. Large groups of Janissaries began gathering in front of their main barracks in the city. The Janissaries first sought support from the artillery corps, fellow soldiers but not part of the Janissary ranks. However, the artillerymen refused to get involved, stating that the Janissaries were strong enough on their own. Furious, the Janissary crowds turned toward the homes of state officials and pashas. Yet something was strange. The beautiful mansions along the Bosphorus seemed abandoned. Not a single official was to be found in their homes. It was as if the entire state leadership had vanished. Undeterred, the soldiers looted every house they entered, setting the city ablaze. Unbeknownst to the Janissaries, as they rampaged and burned the city, Sultan Mahmud II had already set his carefully crafted plan in motion. For years, he had been meticulously working on every detail. His trusted supporter, Alamdar Mustafa Pasha, was no longer by his side. Just 1 year after Mahmud took the throne, Alamdar Mustafa Pasha found himself the target of a massive Janissary assassination attempt. As they stormed his mansion, he fought fiercely but soon found himself cornered by the rebels. Refusing to surrender, he made a bold move. He aimed at the ammunition depot in his own home and fired. The explosion obliterated the mansion, taking out 600 Janissaries along with him in a fiery final stand. Sultan Mahmud had meticulously crafted his plan. While the Janissaries were still gathering outside their barracks, all government officials had already been secretly relocated to a secure place. Loyal military units, brought in from Anatolia, quietly began disembarking from ships along the Bosphorus. The artillery corps, who had refused to support the Janissaries, had actually pledged their loyalty to the Sultan. Most crucially, Mahmud had already started organizing the civilians of Istanbul against the Janissaries. Armed civilians showed up ready for battle, and those without weapons were quickly supplied from the armories. As the Janissaries marched towards the palace, shouting, "Any true Janissary, come with us!" Mahmud's supporters countered with, "Any true Muslim, come with us!" The Sultan himself stood before the gathered crowd, accompanied by the Sheikh al-Islam, Tahir Effendi, the highest religious authority in the empire. Tahir Effendi declared, "We stand with our Sultan. There is no sin in the slaying of the Janissaries. In fact, it is a religious command, for they seek to kill our Khalifa." At this moment, the Sultan's guard raised the sacred banner of the Prophet Muhammad, which had been brought to Istanbul by Mahmud's great-great-grandfather, the terrible Sultan Selim, after conquering the Arab lands and becoming the Khalifa. This was a formal declaration of jihad. The Janissaries were so consumed by greed, looting mansions and hunting for government officials to kill, that they hardly noticed when the real operation began. When they heard that a large crowd of civilians had gathered in a square, they rushed toward it. But suddenly, cannon fire erupted from both sides. The artillery corps, led by Captain the Black Hell Ibrahim, who had sworn loyalty to the Sultan, unleashed a relentless barrage on the Janissaries. The rebels had never imagined they'd be bombarded in the heart of Istanbul. Overwhelmed at first, they quickly retreated to their barracks, setting up a defensive line. But they had no cannons of their own. The city gates were locked, and all entry and exit from Istanbul were sealed off. Huge siege cannons, normally used for attacking fortified castles, were brought in and positioned outside the Janissary barracks. Throughout the night, the artillery bombarded the barracks, tearing everything apart. As dawn broke, the Sultan's loyal soldiers, along with the citizens of Istanbul, stormed the remains of the barracks. Tens of thousands of Janissaries were shot or cut down by swords. For days, bodies of Janissaries floated in the Bosphorus. Historical records suggest that around 40,000 Janissaries were killed on that day alone. But what had led the Ottoman Empire, in the midst of the Greek Revolution, on the brink of war with Russia, with the French preparing to invade Morocco and Algeria, and just after tensions with Egypt's viceroy Muhammad Ali Pasha to destroy its own army? And how had the state and the people come to despise the Janissaries, once the legendary backbone of the empire's military, so intensely? The Janissaries were elite military units established by the Ottoman Empire, requiring significant resources for their training. They were founded during the reign of Sultan Murad I, the third Sultan of the empire, and were inspired by the Roman legion system. According to the Janissary system, boys aged 8 to 14 from Christian families living in the Balkans and Anatolia, preferably Greeks, Albanians, and Serbs, were recruited based on specific criteria. These boys were initially placed with Turkish families who had no children, allowing them to learn Turkish and Islamic customs. This practice was known as the devshirme system. Notably, Muslims were generally not eligible to become Janissaries, with one exception. Bosnians could enlist. There were also criteria regarding the families that received these children. Families living in Istanbul or large cities were not preferred. Instead, those from smaller towns or villages in Anatolia were chosen. Families engaged in arts or crafts were excluded from participation, as it was believed that the soldiers' sole focus should be on military duties without distractions. However, this changed over time. The devshirme system, known as the blood tax by Europeans, had its own specific criteria set by the Ottomans. According to a book written by a former Janissary who was responsible for selecting children as Janissary candidates, some of the criteria were as follows. Only one child could be taken from each village. No children could be taken from households that were within 40 houses of each other. The only son of a family could not be selected. The chosen boy must have no physical defects. The boy had to be handsome. Not too tall, not too short, and free from any disabilities. He needed to be intelligent. He had to have good character. A careful selection process was conducted, considering the potential for these children to assume administrative roles in the future. This practice led to many dramatic folk stories and songs, as countless families in the Balkans saw their children taken away. Although the devshirme system was initially implemented as a tax, over time, voluntary enlistments into the Janissary Corps began to occur. Children taken as Janissaries could return to their homelands as administrators, often maintaining ties with their families and providing them with a better life. Some even rose to the rank of Grand Vizier. For instance, Sokolu Mehmet Pasha, originally Mehmet Sokulović from a Serbian family, became the second highest official in the Ottoman Empire. He is remembered for the Drina Bridge he commissioned, famously featured in Ivo Andrić's book. After living with Turkish families for a time, a second and more formal selection process took place. The recruits were first brought to the capital, where they donned traditional clothing and red caps. They were then assigned to different units based on their abilities and potential. The most intelligent were sent to the Enderun Palace School for training in administrative and technical matters. The strongest recruits became part of the infantry unit known as the Janissary Corps. Janissaries held a status between slave and free man. They could not marry or have children until they retired. Upon their death, their assets were transferred to the Janissary Corps. Their entire family was considered to be the Sultan, whom they referred to as father. Traditionally, the Sultan was recorded as the first member of the Janissary unit. In official titles, instead of Sultan or Padishah, it was written as father. Every 3 months, the Sultan would don Janissary attire and receive his salary as a Janissary, reflecting the unique bond. Janissaries answered solely to the Sultan and could only be punished by him. The commander of the Janissary Corps, known as the Janissary Agassi, ranked just below the Grand Viziers in state administration. While the Janissaries are often portrayed as the symbol of the Ottoman Army in popular media, the reality was quite different. In fact, the Janissaries were relatively modest in numbers compared to the rest of the army. In the 1400s, their numbers were around 5,000. By the 1500s, this grew to nearly 20,000, and in the 1600s, it stabilized at about 40,000. The true strength of the Ottoman military lay in the light cavalry known as the Sipahis. The primary purpose of the Janissaries was to protect the Sultan, usually delivering the final blow in battles. Lightly armored yet agile, the Sipahis would engage the heavier European cavalry and infantry, wearing down the enemy through hit-and-run tactics. Following this, the demoralized and physically exhausted enemy forces would be scattered by the Janissaries and artillery. However, this does not mean that the Janissaries never played a leading role on the battlefield. Significant battles where they had a major impact include the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396, the Battle of Varna in 1444, the Second Battle of Kosovo in 1448, the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, and the Battle of Vadi Sale in 1578. The Varna War and the battles leading up to it saw the Hungarians starting to use primitive firearms, capturing the interest of the Sultans. Sultan Murad II, in particular, recognized that firearms were the future and began efforts to integrate them into the army. These initiatives continued under his son, Mehmed II, who ensured that the Janissaries became the most effective unit wielding firearms of their time. A cannon master named Orban, who had been unable to get his cannon designs accepted by the Hungarian crown, turned to the young Sultan Mehmed II. The young Sultan not only gave Orban a chance, but also learned the intricacies of this technology and produced his own cannon designs. The cannons created by Orban and Sultan Mehmed opened the walls of Constantinople to the Ottomans in 1453. Thus, the Ottoman army transformed into a gunpowder-based force, earning the term Gunpowder Empire in the 15th and 16th centuries. In addition to firearms, the Janissaries preferred weapons such as yataghans and halberds. They also effectively used heavy artillery, bombards, and howitzers. The Janissaries and the cavalry known as sipahs functioned like a well-oiled machine for the Ottomans. The Ottoman Empire's borders had expanded immensely, and during the reign of Mehmed II, they even expressed their desire to capture Rome. However, what rises to the peak eventually begins to decline. The story of the decline of the Janissary army began with a curious event. In 1582, Sultan Murad III organized a grand circumcision ceremony for his son and heir, Prince Mehmed. The festivities were so extravagant that they lasted for days and nights, featuring jugglers, acrobats, and wrestlers. The Sultan, delighted by the performances, asked the entertainers, "What do you wish from me?" Just like in fairy tales. However, he could never have foreseen the consequences of his words. The entertainer's surprising response was, "We want to become Janissaries." Everyone was astonished, but the Sultan was unfazed and granted their wish. He ordered that these disorderly good-for-nothings be enrolled in the Janissary Corps. However, Janissary commander Ferhad Aga protested, stating that this would disrupt the Janissary order and go against tradition. But Sultan Murad insisted. A sultan does not go back on his word, and demanded their enrollment. Ferhad Aga did not want to take on this responsibility, and was subsequently removed from his position. The new Janissary commander created the title Janissary Apprentice as a way to integrate the circus performers into the corps. Yet, the tradition had been irrevocably broken. In old-school empires, tradition is everything. Once disrupted, new customs are always referenced. This also held true for the Janissaries. During this period, the practice of selecting Janissaries from the children of existing Janissaries began. Despite the ban on marriage and children, this led to a decrease in the careful selection of new Janissaries and an increase in disorderly conduct. In 1683, the devshirme system was abolished, and individuals from villages in Anatolia who performed menial tasks began to be registered as Janissaries. Their main aim was to benefit from the privileges of being a Janissary. With high salaries, tax exemptions, and the lifting of trade restrictions, they became powerful merchants. From this point on, the Janissaries' combat skills gradually diminished. This was best realized by Sultan Osman II, better known as the Young Osman. In order to resolve border disputes with Poland, the Sultan led an expedition at the head of the army to lay siege to the castle of Khotin, which today borders Ukraine. However, during the campaign, he made an interesting discovery. The salaries being paid to the Janissaries did not align with the actual number present in the army. Some Janissaries, who were not on the campaign, were falsely counted by their commanders, allowing them to receive their pay without serving. To identify these individuals, Sultan Osman called them one by one for roll call 3 times at different intervals during the campaign. The Janissary commanders, feeling humiliated and losing their pay, turned against the Sultan. This tension affected the campaign, and despite their efforts, they failed to capture the fortress of Khotin. Eventually, a peace treaty was signed, and the army returned to Istanbul. Viewing the failed Khotin campaign as a setback, the young Sultan devised a plan to dismantle the Janissary Corps, which was primarily composed of conscripts, and replace them with only Turkish soldiers gathered from Anatolia, Egypt, and Syria. However, he couldn't openly announce this plan. Instead, he declared that he would undertake a pilgrimage to Mecca, something no Ottoman Sultan had ever done. It's important to understand that traveling from Istanbul to Mecca, with stops along the way, would likely take about 2 years at that time. Naturally, the Janissaries didn't believe him and sparked a massive rebellion. Their demands were clear. 1. The Sultan should not go on pilgrimage. 2. No new army would be established. 3. The 6 closest advisors to the Sultan would be handed over to the Janissaries for execution. Young and inexperienced, and without any contingency plans, Sultan Osman confidently rejected their demands, believing in the authority of his position. This only fueled the rebellion further. They first captured the Sultan, then humiliated him by tearing his clothes, placing him on a donkey and parading him through Istanbul. According to some accounts, they even sexually abused him before eventually killing him. A new sultan ascended the throne. Even though the Janissaries rebelled collectively, the leaders of the uprising were Kara Davut Pasha and the 65th Unit. The new sultan showed no mercy. Regardless of the rebellion being in his favor, he could not allow anyone who had shed the blood of the Ottoman dynasty to live. The throne was sacred and depended on the purity of the family blood. He executed all those personally involved in his brother's murder and even disbanded the 65th Janissary unit completely. The aim was to remind them of the fate of those who spilled the blood of an Ottoman family member. However, this practice ultimately proved ineffective. The Janissaries continued to overthrow sultans, incite rebellions, and force ministers from their positions. Each passing year, they spiraled further out of control. The Janissary Corps was becoming akin to a mafia organization, with thieves, murderers, rapists, and other ne'er-do-wells being registered as Janissaries. The state's most vital army had transformed into an organized crime syndicate that held Istanbul hostage. Disrespect towards state officials and looting public property became commonplace. They would stop passers-by under the pretext of security checks and seize their valuables. Both Muslims and Christians were exasperated by their antics, especially during religious holidays when they would raid Christian neighborhoods, confiscating food and drink meant for celebrations. Not only trade ports, but also fruit and vegetable markets fell under the control of Janissary bullies. This situation led to serious food inflation in Istanbul and caused many producers to go bankrupt. One of the Janissaries' most heinous crimes was their involvement in fires. Normally, Janissaries were responsible for extinguishing fires in Istanbul, but they soon realized they could loot whatever remained after a blaze. This realization turned them from fire extinguishers into arsonists. They would only respond to actual fires if the homeowner was wealthy and promised a generous tip. Otherwise, they ignored the flames. Despite laws against engaging in trade, they would visit shopkeepers and declare themselves unofficial partners. The Janissaries had completely turned the state's military resources to their own advantage. Moreover, they were staunchly opposed to any form of innovation. Sultans and state officials recognized the deteriorating situation and tried to adapt the army by importing new training techniques and technologies from Europe. Yet, the Janissaries rejected all innovations, labeling them as infidel practices, despite not being particularly devout themselves. The necessary military reforms were never successfully implemented by the Ottoman administration until the establishment of the Nizam-e Army by Sultan Selim III in 1793. Selim founded this army with cautious steps to avoid drawing too much attention from the Janissaries. The new army, Nizam-Sedid, was formed because the Janissaries officially responded that they did not want weekly weapons training. They were ostensibly testing new weapons from France. The Nizam-i-Sedid employed modern training techniques, although its numbers were small. During this time, the French army under Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt, which was part of the Ottoman Empire. With British assistance, the new Ottoman army successfully defended Egypt, leading to the El Aris Treaty in 1801, in which France abandoned its ambitions in the region. However, the success of the new army angered the Janissaries. In 1807, under the leadership of Kabachi Mustafa, the Janissaries revolted, demanding the dissolution of the Nizam-e-Sedid. Faced with the uprising, Sultan Selim III was forced to disband the new army and abdicate the throne. His cousin, Mustafa IV, took his place and began holding Selim captive in the palace. Selim was removed from the line of succession, and his nephew, Prince Mahmud, was declared the heir. Former soldiers of the Nizam-e-Sedid, fleeing from the Janissaries, sought refuge with Alemdar Mustafa Pasha, the governor in the Balkans, persuading him to take action to restore Sultan Selim to power. As we mentioned at the beginning of the video, Alemdar Pasha killed the leader of the Janissary rebellion, Kabachi Mustafa, in his quest to restore Selim. However, before he could accomplish his goal, Sultan Selim himself died. Prince Mahmud, who had fled to the roof of the palace, was still alive. Alemdar Mustafa pledged allegiance to him, making Mahmud the new sultan, while Alemdar became the Grand Vizier. Yet there remained no real power capable of abolishing the Janissaries. Alemdar Mustafa's army served merely as a balancing force. The Janissaries, seeking revenge against Alemdar Mustafa Pasha, launched a concerted attack on his mansion one night a year later. Approximately 1,000 Janissaries stormed the residence, looting the treasury and assaulting the concubines. The elderly Pasha looked to Sultan Mahmud for help. Though the Sultan heard the sounds of conflict, he chose not to intervene, as he lacked sufficient forces and believed a sultan should never be indebted to another, which could jeopardize his own throne. He had other plans for the Janissaries. Sultan Mahmud recognized that the situation was more than just a choice between Alemdar Mustafa Pasha and the Janissaries. It represented a critical juncture for the Ottoman Empire. The country was in dire economic straits. The Janissaries had failed to suppress the Greek uprising, forcing the state to seek assistance from its governor in Egypt, Kavalali Mehmet Ali Pasha. Although Kavalali Mehmet Ali Pasha put down this rebellion, he later fell out with Istanbul and started marching towards Istanbul with his army. The Sultan had to seek help from the British and French to stop Mehmet Ali Pasha's advance. However, this aid came at a cost. As a result of the trade agreements, the Ottoman state had become a cheap market for Europe. Additionally, the Russians were poised to attack, and in a few years the French would invade Morocco and Algeria. The Sultan found himself with very limited options. Against this backdrop, the Sultan began to implement a plan that would radically change the Ottoman state. He intended to dismiss key figures within the Janissaries and accelerate the promotions of those loyal to him. The newly promoted commanders would spread false rumors within the Janissary ranks and quickly organize the troops to prevent any uprisings. The number of the Sultan's spies among the Janissaries began to increase rapidly. Sultan Mahmud was acutely aware that failure would not only mean his deposition, but also his death. This understanding drove him to meticulously plan every detail. He secretly placed loyal officers in charge of the artillery units and lower administrative levels. All that remained was to incite the Janissaries. For this purpose, students receiving religious education were employed. Medrese students began openly provoking the Janissaries with inflammatory remarks. Fights increased within the city, and the people of Istanbul started to harbor intense anger toward the Janissaries for attacking the students. The smear campaigns against the Janissaries escalated to the point where the graves of 2 Janissaries were exhumed, with claims that they rose from the dead at night to commit vampirism. Boiling oil was poured over the corpses, and stakes were driven through them, with the incident reported in the official newspaper of the time. Tension had been building steadily until June 16, 1826. On that fateful day, the people of Istanbul, led by the Sultan and artillery units, wiped out tens of thousands of Janissaries. The city had harbored such deep-seated hatred that the loss of these soldiers sparked immense celebrations among the populace. Music filled the air, and local dances erupted in the streets. It felt as though the country had been freed from a cancer. Sultan Mahmud quickly established a new army. A politically savvy leader, he named this new force Asakir-i-Mansur-i-Muhammadiyya, or Muhammad's victorious soldiers, thereby wrapping the modernization efforts in a religious cloak. Sultan Mahmud and his successors attempted various reforms, but they were ultimately too late. During the Crimean War in 1852, the Ottoman Army fought alongside the British, French, Italians, and Swiss against the Russians. However, the Ottomans were financially crippled, leading them to borrow heavily from Europe. This cycle of debt and interest spiraled out of control, and by 1881, major state enterprises that generated the empire's primary tax revenues fell under the management of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, the IMF of its time. The Ottoman Empire experienced annual economic decline, facing nationalist uprisings, internal conflicts, and the First World War. The saga of the Ottoman dynasty, which began on horseback in Anatolia 7 centuries ago, came to a poignant end with the death of the last sultan in exile in a hotel room in Italy. From the once mighty Janissaries, only the military band known as the Mehter team, which revived the victory songs of the past.